Hi, I'm Greg Schaefer. Welcome to the virtual CISO moment. Phishing guru Cary Johnson joins us today. Cary, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, glad to be here. Thank you. Thanks for having me, Greg, really.
Glad that you were able to make it. Glad that. Sorry about the little scheduling snafu that I had in the beginning. That was me. To everybody out there, if you put the wrong link in the URL, you're not going to go where you think you're going to go. So sometimes,
Exactly.
And that's actually going to lead into what we're going to talk about a little bit more. Be careful about what you click on. Anyway, it could be a wrong link.
Mm,
Um,
good.
Gary, would love to hear about your story, how you first got into information security and cybersecurity, and just take us through your career and what led you to what you're doing today.
Oh, absolutely. So I started in the VAR world, of course, the value-added reseller world. I worked for Robert Herjavec, who many
Hmm.
people may be familiar with. I reported directly to him for about 7 years. And then I went out on my own. I started my own company, TJ5, which stood for the Johnson 5, my family. And at the time, the idea was that I was going to replicate the VAR model from my previous employer with the Herjavec Group. And I quickly got diverted to what ended up being the direction for the rest of my life, and that was phishing. So I had a client here in the Canadian federal government that asked me if I had a solution for phishing and explained to me some of the concerns that they had. And I went off and I thought about it, and it came up with this idea that if I used an email marketing tool to, instead of using it for marketing and taking the client to your website and then knowing who the client is and when they hit your website and all those metrics, if instead I created a simulation and sent it to employees, I could get metrics and report on the results of the phishing campaigns. So
Hmm.
yeah, that's the big secret no one knows about, is that commercial off-the-shelf simulators are basically just re-provision email marketing tools. So I'd been doing that for years before it was introduced as an innovation by the security awareness industry.
I never thought about that,
That's
but
how
that
I
makes a lot
started.
of sense. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the exact same thing. It's just reprovision. It's the same metrics and all that stuff. So the first simulation I did was to Treasury Board of Canada, and it was a BlackBerry ID reset. And I don't know if US is familiar with well, everyone, you guys had Blackberries too back then. Remember, we used to call them
Oh,
crackberries. Yeah.
yeah. I still
And
have mine, by the way. I have it. It's somewhere in my basement, but I do have it.
yeah, I still had one until just a couple years ago. I preferred the way the buttons worked. Like you're
Exactly.
actually,
Yeah.
yes. However, back then, that's all the federal government used. So the BlackBerry ID reset simulation was very contextually relevant. They loved it. And I got a contract with the Treasury Board. And because they set guidelines for other departments, it just took off from there. So I went from, I'm going to sell all these products as a VAR to like just doing phishing training. And I've been doing it now 14 and a half years.
And fishing is just one of those things that I know a lot of people. I know we'll talk about it a little bit more later, but I think about fishing and I think about the reactions that I get often is that you have people that don't like it sometimes. They click on it and they feel like that it's being punitive, but it's really all about educating, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's the approach that you take, right? The first thing you got to do when you introduce employees to a program is tell them these are skills they need in today's online world to protect themselves at home and at work. It has to be something in it for them. And one of the things that the legacy vendors do, and they've always done, is they use simulations to introduce more product, to sell more product. So they send people off to training every time they click, and that comes across as punitive. It
Mhm.
doesn't come across as punitive to everybody, but as a collective group, you're going to have a percentage of people that see it as punitive, and they take offense to it. The way I run my program is I don't send anyone to supplemental training until they click 4 times over a period of a year. And I have a way of identifying a minimum ratio of employees that are responsible for the most clicks. I call it the 15-50 principle. So generally speaking, 15% of your people will be responsible for over 50% of your cumulative clicks. I call them the movers. They move into the focus training group. But the key here is they've had ample time to learn and they don't feel punished. If they've clicked 4 times, they get it. They need supplemental training. Right?
So yeah, so what got you to land on the 4? I'm just curious. That sometimes is it that like we have a tendency sometimes as humans to make mistakes, and why go after them on the first one?
Well, what it does is my 1550 principle identifies 3 types of employees. You have your never clickers. They generally tend to be about 50%. You have your learners. They're the ones that click 1, 2, or 3 times. But when you look into the data, you'll find they clicked early and stopped. They learned. Then you have your movers that move into the 1550 principle. Now, legacy vendors hate this stuff and they would tear it apart because organizations then are reducing their need for product, both from a cost and an operational disruption perspective. If you're only training the 15% responsible for 50% of the clicks, you're optimizing your training and reducing costs. And the amazing thing about the principle is as you drive continuous improvement, it remains intact. It just becomes less people. So the people that need training will eventually move into that focus group.
So I always ask this question at this part in the podcast, this segment, and this may or may not, I think, probably going to dovetail with what you're talking about with phishing. But from your perspective, what is currently today? What is one or a couple of the most significant threats that small and mid-sized businesses face with regards to information security? Is it in fact phishing awareness and just awareness in general, or are there other elements that feed into that?
Well, my biased opinion would say phishing, of course, right? But I mean, it's undeniable that phishing is where 90% of targeted attacks start. You see it in the Verizon data breach investigation report and all of the reports that come out. So to me, that's the biggest human risk. I mean, you've got vendors that are trying to make human risk management about a lot of other things, but that is the most critical and most probable human risk. And training should be commensurate, and it should be focused on doing that well. When you try to do too many things, you don't do any of it well. You overwhelm people. And I think that the biggest threat to small to medium-sized businesses is there's no training programs developed for them. There's too much information they're being thrown at. There's too much product that they have to buy, and then they have to make sense of it and run it. Whereas I run a managed service program that focuses specifically on training for phishing, and that's going to be the biggest threat to the small and medium-sized business. I'm sure you agree. Like, there's a lot of advice out there that tends to be overwhelming to small and medium-sized businesses because the advice is geared towards larger organizations that require a more mature security posture. They require more product, more layers, whereas it can be very much simplified for the small to medium-sized businesses, in my opinion.
No, absolutely. That's one of my, what I like to call my soapbox items, where I feel that us as an industry are not doing enough to focus on the needs of small and mid-sized businesses. And to your point, and I know we've had some discussions about this on LinkedIn as well too, but to your point, a lot of the awareness vendors out there, you have to have like a minimum number of licenses. So if you've got a business that's like a startup that has 5 or 10 people, and they are definitely in one of the biggest risk areas because, and it could also be one of the biggest threat areas to other organizations because they might be producing a product that larger organizations use. But yet these companies, and it's not just limited to phishing awareness, but other services, they sometimes will say, well, you have to have a minimum of 50 seat licenses or 100 seat licenses because they're more concerned about profit because each margin for each license is so small. And that's a huge problem in the industry. So I appreciate you addressing that. Is that something that your ecosystem handles? I mean, can you do like small engagements?
Yeah, so we have a product that we're developing that we've always been using with our larger organizations, but we're re-provisioning it for small and medium-sized businesses, and that's our help module with a phish quiz. So it's basically a 4-step process that teaches them very simplified, easy skills, 4 simple skills to create a reflex around. And then it's followed with a phish quiz that proposes to them various different phishing scenarios. And it covers all types of phishing. whether it's text phishing, email phishing, phishing through social media. And in the fish quiz, we propose all these different communication channels, and they have to determine whether it's real or phishing. And it cuts right to where it needs to be, and it's very cost effective because it is a scalable product for us. So we could sell it to people that have 10, 5, or 500. And that's the focus that we have now, is that we really want to start providing security services with regards to phishing awareness to small to medium-sized businesses. Because, as to your point, Greg, the larger organizations are getting attacked through these smaller vendors.
Exactly.
Vendors call it vendor email compromise. And this is the sort of soft belly, the sort of the attack vector that's being exploited. And the problem is there just isn't solutions for them. Like when you say that they have to buy a minimum seat license, it's not only that. What they're provided with is just a set of tools, and it's an overwhelming set of tools. And they then have to make sense of it and run it themselves. And people in small to medium-sized businesses just don't have the expertise to do that. They just don't have someone that knows how to use these tools. I mean, there's a lot of consultants out there that actually work with organizations to teach them how to use the legacy vendor tools. I mean, think about that. Like, it's tools. They don't run themselves, right?
Right, and then that becomes like another expense for them, where it's like, instead of having now you have to bring in a consultant to tell them how to run the tools, teach them how to run the tools, and yet if they don't do something like that, they're running the tools without really being as effective as it can be, because you really, is it fair to say that you really need to try to figure out, when you're running these sort of campaigns, where your gaps are and try to target towards that? I mean, or does that play into the overall phishing strategy?
Well, I find the biggest problem with the legacy approach is that it doesn't provide a measurement framework that creates objective metrics. Like, there's no program out there where you can conclusively say this is working to address our phishing problem. The results of the campaigns tend to fluctuate due to the complexity level and the sophistication level of the actual campaigns themselves. So you don't have visibility into the actual impact. And without that visibility, you can't autocorrect your program and address gaps. So what I do is I have a scientific methodology, a patent pending algorithm that actually creates true baselines, resets them every campaign. So now, looking forward, you have a baseline, but looking back, you have objective key performance indicators. Now you can start addressing these gaps. And that's the approach that I see is in the future of security awareness, because right now we're moving towards this human risk management profile, and they're trying to address this issue of a lack of performance metric, but they're doing it with subjective quantifiable metrics, whereas I do it with objective quantifiable metrics, right? So objective metrics are quantifiable, but quantifiable metrics are not objective. And that's, you need to have that visibility into the impact.
Exactly, because otherwise, in some ways, if you don't have that sort of feedback, you're kind of spinning your wheels somewhat. You said something that I want to ping on that I thought was very interesting, and it may have been something that I saw from you online earlier, or maybe from someone else. But you started to go down talking about phishing. You said email phishing, voice phishing, text phishing. Well, we have traditionally, and I've never really cared for this, we've called like text phishing smishing for SMS message phishing, and voice phishing would be vishing, and then you got whaling and all that stuff. Is there a trend, and I hope that there is, to stop with all these like ridiculous like specifics? It's like, instead of using these different terms which confuse people, to just like say phishing and then tack on the forefront the type of phishing. So again, email, text phishing, and so on. Is this a trend, or is this a Cary Johnson solo effort?
It's a solo effort, because the vendors in the industry, they want to break this stuff all up so they can sell more product, and it just gets confusing to the common user, right? But if you take a typical example, a very common attack right now, where a vendor a hacker impersonates a vendor to a larger organization, sends either a wire transfer request or sends an attachment with an invoice. The industry will call that vendor email compromise, right? And now vendor email compromise is a type of business email compromise, which is a type of phishing, which is a type of social engineering. It's just getting ridiculous. It's phishing, right? What it is, simply phishing. When I do our fish quiz with clients, I don't get into those definitions. I just tell them how to attack and decipher phishing with 4 simple steps. But I do get into the definitions when they're doing the quiz. So if I have an example where there's a voice phishing attack, and they decide, okay, this is phishing, I'll say correct, commonly known as vishing. And then that way I'm getting the definition across in case that's how they identify it. But I don't go into trying to create various different modules based on whether it's phishing, quishing, BEC, VEC, and all this stuff. I think it just confuses people in the end.
Wait a minute. Quishing, is that QR phishing?
Yeah.
Quishing.
It's funny because you hear about this all the time now, right? This is the big thing that vendors have jumped on in marketing, this QR phishing thing, like it's brand new. But McAfee posted something on their website on their blog or vlog or whatever. It's over 12 years ago. Where does that QR code go? And if you just look up McAfee, where does that QR? It's not anything new. I think it's something new because vendors now are able to incorporate that into their COT simulator. So now they're bringing it to the forefront that it's a big issue. Right.
Now, I brought this up before on this podcast, and this is about marketing. And marketing, if you can rebrand a known threat, it now becomes a new threat, in which case you have to do something different. I believe that that's the general marketing thought. For me, and some of the ancient network folks out there might be able to relate to this, the first time I was exposed to this, and it really torqued me, was in the networking world. So I grew up with, we had hubs, which was layer 2. We had routers, which were layer 3. And then we had switches, which were layer 2. Hubs were actually layer 1. I'm sorry. Let me make sure I get my stuff right. It's switches layer 2, MAC level, and routers layer 3.
I wrote a book about this.
So I'll have to reference it. But at some point in time, I started to come across something, and we're talking, this is like 25 years ago, something called layer 3 switches. And I'm like, that makes no sense. What is a layer 3 switch? Switches operate on layer 2, routers on layer 3. Well, what it was is basically a router, maybe had 1 or 2 additional features, but it was a router. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what this difference was when there really wasn't. Next gen firewalls being another one as well too. And you can go down the line. So all this stuff about rebranding, vishing or squishing or quishing or whatever it was, it's just a different form of phishing. People need to be aware that it's not necessarily a new threat. There are very few new threats out there. There are just different ways on how existing threats are exploited. But now, having gone through that soapbox, I'll get off my platform. I need to ask you something that is kind of new. From the perspective of phishing, how is artificial intelligence? We see a lot of generative AI now out ever since ChatGPT became somewhat useful on the scene back in November of 22. How do you see generative AI factoring into the whole phishing ecosystem?
With regards to the AI, it's changed phishing dramatically. I mean, phishing doesn't have a bunch of spelling and grammatical errors now, or a weird, odd look and feel. It's very logo and image based. The language is perfectly done. Phishing can be done by anyone, anywhere in the world in English, and they don't even speak English. And it's not just AI, it's also phishing as a service, the black market, where you can buy entire packages of simulations, phishing attacks that are geared towards Microsoft environments, which is the most common environment. And again, these people that are running these attacks, they don't even speak English, some of them. So it's dramatically changed landscape, and you can see it in the simulations. I keep saying simulations, sorry, Greg. You can see it in the actual phishing attacks, and I post them a lot on my content. It has changed dramatically. I mean, these attacks nowadays are tricky. They're sophisticated. They look identical to the real thing. It's just amazing, some of the stuff that I'm seeing, and it's been over the last year and a half.
So it really, though, when all is said and done, the attacks look different. The intent is still the same. They're trying to get you to do something that you wouldn't normally do. But what we have to do is we have to be more aware, not necessarily of a different name for something that's existing, but for the change of something that is existing, that instead of, like you said, instead of the traditional, well, spelling errors or grammatical errors, or look to see if there's something different in the URL or what have you. Well, that's still valid, actually. Consider that you could have a perfectly crafted email, and you can have a perfectly crafted email that mimics exactly your CEO's tone if they had just gotten a couple of examples of the CEO's letter, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it makes it that much more difficult.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. Well,
yeah, and not only that, I mean, there's also deepfakes, right?
before we get off of phishing, I got one more quick question, and I know we got just a little bit of a lag here, and it's because of the 14 satellites we're going off of Starlink in order to hit you up there in Canada. So, but not really.
It's the cloud.
The cloud. Yeah, we're going through the clouds. We're going through the cloud multiple times, it seems like. I just want to touch on punitive one more time, because I use this example often, that back in the day, there was one CISO I knew that what they would do is, if somebody failed a phishing test, the first one, they would, the CISO had successfully implemented a policy where that person's bonus was affected. So you talk about punitive, you click on one, you could lose some real money. Just briefly, from your perspective, we said that punitive is not the reason for doing phishing exercise. It's all about educating, muscle memory, and all that as well too. But what's like a big negative effect of doing it punitive? I mean, could it be, for example, that someone gets so afraid to click on anything that they're almost paralyzed?
In rare circumstances that could happen, but what I see more often is I think you're getting into almost a legal issue potentially. When you have employees going to HR and complaining that they feel threatened by the simulations and the approach that's taken. I mean, that's just a legal problem waiting to blow up somewhere, and it probably has. We just haven't heard about it. It hasn't made the news enough times. But punishing people for phishing simulation failures is the biggest mistake you can make. You hear about the industry talking about creating a security culture. Well, you're creating a negative culture when you do that kind of stuff. But I will say this, it does depend on the industry. So when I get a new client, I'm always very cognizant of the inherent security culture of the industry they are in. For example, I work with Department of National Defense. I work with various government departments here, high-risk organizations, and they have an inherent security culture that they know the inherent danger of a single incident. So you can approach it differently with them. You can be more punitive. I hate to even use the word, but you can get away with being more punitive because there is no excuse to not be security conscious.
Right.
Example, Department of National Defense, in the military, I could run campaigns every week if I had to, and the approach that they take would be vastly different from an organization that has more social responsibility to their employees. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but there's an inherent culture that you have to be aware of, and it vastly changes the way that you want to approach people that fail these tests.
Well, it would probably just boil down to also like your risk environment. There are certain things that are riskier what people do, and particularly if you're talking about defense, you're talking about life and limb. You're talking about. I'm reminded I used to work at a hospital, and not me, but one of my colleagues. did a great job with their first configuration of a router interface, but they were on the wrong interface and it took down surgery, which wasn't a good thing at the time. But it was in the 90s, so they weren't really relying upon the network connection that much. It's not. But nowadays, you do something like that, you could literally kill someone.
Yeah.
A lot of stress in our field, though, talking about all this, because it is important what we do. It is important that we protect, and it's important to try to make sure that people are being trained the same way. I'm sure that you encounter stress in what you're doing. So, what's one of the things, Cary, that you do to decompress from all this stress in the cyber world?
Oh, I go fishing.
Ah, okay. There's a lot of fishing up there, I guess. I just clicked the
Yeah,
wrong button.
like I love to
Sorry
walleye
about
fish. Preferably, I like trout fishing, but walleye fishing, any sort of fish. Like I honestly, I joke all the time on my posts that if I'm not fishing, I'm fishing, and that's what I
that.
do. As a matter of fact, on Monday I'll be going. Yeah, yeah. On Monday I'll be going back up to the trailer, and we'll be closing out for the season. But as soon as the ice forms over, I'll be ice fishing. That's what I do.
That's awesome. And you're literally away from, I think one of the most important things to do is to get away from the technology for a while. I have done the past couple of months an excellent job of like removing distractions from my phone. One of the things is, it's kind of a side note, but one of the things that
Mhm.
has de-stressed me a bit is that I used to have alerts for almost everything. And I used to, every time I'd add a new app, I'd have the alert come through. So I got 5 different news apps. I got this, I got that. And it'd just be drawing me away every single time. And now I'm to the point, it's just like none of that stuff is as important. Let me just stay focused. Let me stay present. And I don't think that there's a better way to stay present than probably fishing, because you're just there. There's nothing else around you except for the little fishies that may become dinner at some point in time. So uh, what are your future plans, Cary?
Well, over the next 5 years, I would really like to retire. Um,
Me too.
I got some people that rely on me here in the organ. Yeah, I have some people that rely on me here in the company that I want to give the business to. I don't really have anything I don't have an exit strategy in terms of selling anything because we run a managed service. But I want to make sure that the people that are younger that work here are ready to take over and do the job on their own and be secure for their future. And then I'll just be fishing for fish in the next
That
five
sounds
years.
like that sounds like an awesome plan. I keep on saying that I'm looking forward to retirement too. I'm still a couple of years away from 60, but I'm getting close. So, but I don't know. I love what I do, and sometimes if you love what
We're
you
the
do,
same age.
so 57,
We're
57.
the same age. That's why I think we resonate because I you pick up on my jokes all the time, like right off the bat, and then I pick up on yours when you're referencing something from Happy Days or whatever it may be, right? And it just glazes over Jen's heads, and I remember posting something about Billy Joel, and you were right on it. Right? Like I said, what's a real estate novelist anyway, right? And
Yes, and
you were
that
saying
led to the
someone in
whole
real estate that
CISO.
wrote a book.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
that led to the whole CISO novelist
yes,
thing.
that's
Yeah,
right. And
it's
then
like
I called you a CISO novelist, and you stole it. You stole it, and you stuck it on
I
your LinkedIn profile.
I did. So everybody who you look on my LinkedIn profile, it says CISO novelist. It's there partially because I fancy myself as a fiction writer. I went independent to have more time to write fiction, and that didn't happen. I just have not enough time. But it's this gentleman here who is responsible for the moniker of CISO novelist. And I
Yep,
loved it so much, it is now part of my official LinkedIn profile. Cary, thank you so much for
and I'm
joining
proud.
us today, and you should be proud. Really appreciate your time. And again, I apologize. I know the folks listening and watching don't realize it, but in the beginning, we had a little bit of a delay in recording this because basically I was an idiot. I had the wrong URL, and I'm wondering, where's Cary? He's not in the room. And he's in the other virtual studio wondering, where's Greg? He's not in the room. And when that happens, it's bad. You don't connect. But we got it worked out. I want to say a couple of things just
Yep.
before that I need to make sure that people know about. The first thing is that I mentioned last week about Hacker Halted. Here's the little sticker that I've got here for it. If you look in the show notes, you'll see a code in Hacker Halted. It's a conference in Atlanta in late October. I believe it's the 30th and the 31st, or thereabouts. You'll see a code that'll get you free registration. So if you're interested and you're in the Atlanta area, definitely look into that. You'll also have a code down in there for the upcoming cohort for the Certified Virtual CISO. If you click on that and use the code that will also be in this show notes, you can get $500 off going to that. And as always, I always like to promote information security for small and mid-sized businesses. You can get it on Amazon. There is currently also every day during the month of October, I am posting every day a tip from the book, and there's a code there to get 20% off. You just go to that link and automatically it's applied. You're ordering it not from Amazon, from somewhere else, but it's all good. Cary, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure. It's been a pleasure, Greg. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And everybody, stay secure.